In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across Europe and into Germany itself, millions of German families awaited news of their husbands, fathers, and sons. The women who had remained on the home front had endured years of separation, rationing, and bombing raids. They had kept households together, raised children alone, and clung to letters from the front as their only connection to the men they loved. But as the war ended and survivors began returning home, another truth emerged from the rubble of the Third Reich. From Norway to Greece, from France to the Soviet Union, German soldiers had left behind a legacy that would shock their families and haunt Europe for generations. Thousands of women in occupied countries had borne children fathered by German soldiers. Some of these relationships had been voluntary, born of genuine affection in the midst of war. Many others had grown from coercion, exploitation, or outright rape. The wives in Germany knew nothing of these other women, these other children. They had believed in the image of their husbands as loyal defenders of the Reich and faithful partners. The discovery of these secret families would shatter that illusion and force millions to confront uncomfortable truths about the men they thought they knew. This is the story of the double lives led by German soldiers during the Second World War, the systems that enabled their conduct, and the women on both sides who paid the price. It is a story about propaganda and reality, about silence and revelation, and about the hidden human costs of Nazi Germany's war of conquest. To understand the shock experienced by German wives after the war, we must first understand the world they believed they inhabited. The Nazi regime had constructed an elaborate mythology around the German family, placing it at the very center of their racial ideology. Nazi propaganda presented a clear vision of gender roles. Men were warriors and providers, defenders of the folk and the homeland. Women were mothers and homemakers, guardians of racial purity and nurturers of the next generation. The regime celebrated the large family as the foundation of German strength. Women who bore many children received the Ehrenkreuz der deutschen Mutter, the Cross of Honor of the German mother, in bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. This ideology was not merely aspirational, it was enforced through law and social pressure. The Nazi state promoted marriage through financial incentives, including marriage loans that could be paid off by having children. The regime criminalized abortion for Aryan women while forcing it upon those deemed racially undesirable. Nazi women's organizations, particularly the NS Frauenschaft and the League of German Girls, indoctrinated millions in these values from childhood. For German wives, this propaganda created a framework for understanding their lives during the war. When their husbands departed for the front, they remained behind as keepers of the home, as mothers to their children, as symbols of the stable German family for which soldiers supposedly fought. The regime assured them that their men were not only defending Germany, but carrying German civilization to barbarous lands. The propaganda emphasized loyalty and faithfulness as core German virtues. Soldiers were portrayed as devoted husbands who longed for home. Letter writing was encouraged and celebrated. The regime even produced guidelines for wives on how to write supportive letters that would maintain soldiers' morale without burdening them with problems from home. This carefully constructed image would prove to be a fiction, but for the women who lived within it, the fiction felt like reality. They had no reason to doubt it, and every incentive to believe. When German forces swept across Europe between 1939 and 1942, they brought not only military occupation, but a massive displacement of young German men far from home. Millions of soldiers found themselves stationed in foreign countries, separated from their wives and families, not for weeks or months, but for years at a time. The conditions of occupation created a profound power imbalance between German soldiers and local populations. In occupied territories, German military personnel held absolute authority. They controlled resources, determined who ate and who went hungry, who lived and who might be arrested or deported. This power dynamic shaped every interaction between occupiers and occupied. For many German soldiers, the years abroad represented a kind of freedom from the constraints of life at home. They were far from wives, parents, and the watchful eyes of their communities. They possessed authority they had never known in civilian life. And they found themselves in countries where, despite the propaganda about German racial superiority, many local women lived in desperate circumstances that made them vulnerable. The Wehrmacht presence in occupied territories was not uniform. In Western Europe, particularly in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the occupation took on a different character than in the East. German authorities initially sought to portray the occupation as civilized and orderly. Soldiers had more freedom of movement, more interaction with local populations, and more opportunities for leisure activities in cities that remained largely intact. In France, particularly in Paris, some German soldiers experienced an almost surreal existence. They frequented cafes and theaters, attended concerts, and strolled through parks. Here, in the supposed heart of enemy territory, some developed genuine relationships with French women. These relationships ranged from brief encounters to years-long affairs to, in some cases, genuine emotional attachments that would outlast the war. The situation in Norway presented another variation. German forces occupied Norway from 1940 to 1945, and the occupation was relatively less brutal than in other territories. German soldiers had considerable freedom, and Norwegian society remained relatively intact. Relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women were common enough to become a social phenomenon that would have lasting consequences. Eastern Europe told a darker story. In Poland and the occupied Soviet territories, Nazi racial ideology manifested in its most brutal form. The regime viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for enslavement or extermination. Official policy forbade relationships between German soldiers and local women. The penalty for such relationships, particularly for the women involved, could be severe. Yet even here, despite official prohibitions and severe penalties, relationships occurred. Soldiers stationed for months or years in garrison towns and occupied cities formed connections with local women. Some of these arose from genuine feeling, however improbable given the circumstances. Many others grew from the exploitation of desperate women who needed food, protection, or simply the hope of survival in impossible conditions.
Alongside individual relationships, whether voluntary or coerced, the German military established and maintained an extensive system of brothels throughout occupied Europe. This network represented organized sexual exploitation on a massive scale, and it involved not only local women who entered these establishments willingly or under economic pressure, but also women who were forced into sexual slavery. The Wehrmacht operated hundreds of military brothels across occupied territories. The official rationale was twofold: to maintain soldier morale and to prevent sexually transmitted diseases through regulated prostitution. Soldiers received vouchers that could be exchanged for access to these establishments. The brothels were organized, regulated, and supplied by military authorities. In Western European territories, women who worked in military brothels typically did so under economic duress. With local economies disrupted, employment scarce, and food rationed, some women made desperate choices. The military brothel offered payment, food rations, and relative safety from other forms of violence. The choice was rarely free in any meaningful sense, but it was not always forced at gunpoint. The situation in Eastern Europe was far more sinister. In occupied Poland and Soviet territories, the SS and Wehrmacht forcibly conscripted women into sexual slavery. Women from concentration camps, prisoner of war camps, and occupied villages were taken to serve in brothels established for military use. Jewish women, Polish women, Russian women, and others deemed racially inferior by Nazi ideology were subjected to systematic rape under the guise of an organized system. Documentation from concentration camps reveals the existence of brothels within the camps themselves, where female prisoners were forced to service male prisoners as a supposed reward for productivity. At Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps, women were selected from the prisoner population and forced into these establishments. For these women, refusal meant death. The scale of this system was enormous. Historical research has identified hundreds of documented locations across occupied Europe. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of women passed through this system, though exact numbers may never be known. German soldiers patronizing these establishments did not, for the most part, view their actions as rape or exploitation. The military structure had normalized the practice. The ideology of racial superiority had dehumanized the women involved, and the distance from home had loosened whatever moral constraints might have operated in civilian life. The wives in Germany knew nothing of this system. The military did not discuss it in letters or official communications. German newspapers did not report it. It existed as a hidden infrastructure of occupation, visible only to those who participated and those who suffered.
The relationships between German soldiers and women in occupied territories produced a generation of children who would carry the mark of occupation for their entire lives. These children, born across Europe between 1940 and 1945, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. In Norway, an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 children were born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers during the occupation. The Norwegian government called them Tyskerbarna, German children. Their mothers were called Tyskertoer, German whores. After the liberation, these women and their children faced severe persecution. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public, were paraded through streets, and faced social ostracism. The children were placed in orphanages or psychiatric institutions at rates far exceeding the general population. Some were abused or neglected. Many grew up never knowing their fathers' identities. France saw a similar phenomenon on an even larger scale. Estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 children were born to French women and German fathers during the occupation. After liberation, these children faced stigma and discrimination. Their mothers were accused of collaboration horizontale, horizontal collaboration, a bitter phrase that reduced complex human situations to simple betrayal. Some women were prosecuted, imprisoned, or had their property confiscated. The children themselves often grew up in silence about their origins, a silence enforced by shame and social pressure. In the occupied Soviet territories, the situation was even more tragic. Many children born of relationships or rapes involving German soldiers did not survive the war. Those who did often faced lives of extreme hardship. Soviet authorities showed little sympathy for women who had fraternized with the enemy, willingly or not. In a society already devastated by the war, these children represented an unwelcome reminder of occupation and defeat. The Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and other occupied territories each had their own populations of occupation children. Across Europe, these children numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly as many as 500,000 or more. For the vast majority of these children, their German fathers never acknowledged them. Many soldiers never knew of their existence. Others knew, but made no effort to maintain contact or provide support. Some attempted to bring their foreign lovers and children to Germany, but found the process impossible, either due to military regulations during the war or practical obstacles afterward. The children grew up marked by their origins. In many countries, they could not escape the stigma. Their mixed heritage was visible in their features or known through community gossip. They faced discrimination in school, in employment, and in social life. Many struggled with questions of identity, belonging to neither their mother's nations, which rejected them, nor to Germany, which did not know they existed. While their husbands lived these double lives abroad, German wives endured their own trials on the home front. As the war progressed, life in Germany grew increasingly difficult. The hardships they faced made them cling more tightly to the ideals of family and faithfulness they believed united them with their absent husbands. In the early years of the war, when victories came quickly and casualties remained relatively low, life on the home front maintained a veneer of normalcy. Women managed households, raised children, and maintained correspondence with their husbands at the front. The regime's propaganda machine worked to maintain morale, presenting the war as a necessary struggle that would soon be won. As the war ground on, conditions deteriorated. Men's absence from the workforce forced women into roles the Nazi ideology had rejected. Factories desperately needed workers, and women filled positions previously held by men. The contradiction between propaganda about women's domestic role and the reality of their labor went largely unremarked. Necessity trumped ideology. Food rationing grew progressively stricter. The ration cards that determined who ate and how much became the center of daily life. Women spent hours in queues waiting for scarce supplies. The black market flourished, and those without connections or resources suffered. Mothers watched their children grow thin and struggled to provide adequate nutrition. The bombing campaigns that began in earnest in 1942 and intensified thereafter brought the war home in the most literal sense. British and American bombers targeted German cities night after night. Women and children huddled in shelters as explosions shook the earth above them. Homes were destroyed, neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the firestorms that consumed cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. Through all of this, letters from the front provided a crucial psychological anchor. The regime encouraged correspondence, understanding that maintaining the connection between soldiers and their families was essential for morale on both fronts. Women treasured these letters, reading and rereading them, sharing news with relatives and neighbors. The letters soldiers sent home painted a sanitized picture of life at the front. They spoke of duty, hardship, and longing for home. They did not speak of the women in occupied territories, the children born there, or the systematic exploitation that characterized the occupation. Most soldiers maintained the fiction of faithfulness, either out of guilt, calculation, or genuine compartmentalization of their lives. German wives had no way to verify the truth. They lived within the closed information environment of the Nazi state. Newspapers and radio provided only the regime's perspective. Rumors occasionally circulated about soldiers' conduct abroad, but these were vague and easily dismissed as enemy propaganda or the gossip of malcontents. The ideology that had shaped their understanding of marriage and family also shaped their interpretation of absence. Separation was a sacrifice for the greater good. Faithfulness was expected, assumed, and therefore not questioned. The possibility that their husbands might be living entirely different lives abroad, might have formed attachments or families elsewhere, existed outside the framework within which they understood their world. As Germany's military situation grew desperate in 1944 and 1945, the focus of women on the home front turned to simple survival. Allied forces closed in from east and west. Bombing raids intensified, cities burned, food supplies collapsed. The carefully maintained fiction of normal family life disintegrated, but the illusion of faithful, loyal husbands fighting for home remained intact. The end of the war in May 1945 brought not peace, but a different kind of chaos. Germany lay in ruins. Millions of soldiers entered captivity. Millions of refugees fled westward ahead of advancing Soviet forces. The Nazi state collapsed, its ideology discredited, its leaders dead or on trial. In this chaos, the hidden truths of the war began to emerge. For many German wives, the first revelation came not from their husbands, but from their absence. Millions of German soldiers did not return. They had died in battle, perished in captivity, or simply disappeared in the war's final chaotic months. For their wives, the question of faithfulness became moot. The dead took their secrets with them. Those soldiers who did return came back to a country transformed. The physical destruction was evident everywhere, but the psychological and moral destruction went deeper. The Allied occupation forces brought evidence of the Holocaust, of systematic atrocities, of crimes that shocked even those Germans who had supported the regime. In this context of revealed horror, the smaller betrayals of unfaithfulness seemed almost trivial, yet they were not trivial to the women who discovered them. Some wives learned the truth through indirect channels. Letters from abroad, long delayed by the war's disruption of postal services, arrived after the surrender. Some contained confessions or pleas for understanding. Others were intercepted by Allied authorities and came to light during the occupation. In Norway, the Norwegian government sought information about German fathers of Tøyskerunger, occupation children. Thousands of mothers provided names, ranks, and last known addresses of German soldiers. Some of these men were still alive, had returned to Germany, and had never mentioned their Norwegian families. Letters from Norwegian authorities sometimes reached German wives, informing them of the existence of children they never knew existed. Similar revelations occurred across occupied territories. Women from France, the Netherlands, Poland, and elsewhere sought to contact the fathers of their children, hoping for financial support, official recognition, or simply knowledge of the men's fates. These inquiries sometimes found their way to wives in Germany. The reactions of German wives varied enormously. Some refused to believe the accusations, dismissing them as enemy propaganda or cases of mistaken identity. Others confronted their returned husbands and received admissions of truth. Many marriages did not survive these revelations. Divorce, while complicated in the post-war chaos, became more common as the social structures that had enforced marital stability collapsed. But perhaps the most common reaction was silence. Germany in the immediate post-war years was not a place conducive to examining uncomfortable truths. The country faced devastation, occupation, and division. People focused on survival, on finding food and shelter, on rebuilding from rubble. The psychological capacity to confront painful personal betrayals was limited when everyone was traumatized and struggling. Moreover, the entire nation was engaged in a process of forgetting and denial. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, was built partly on collective amnesia about Nazi crimes. Germans were encouraged to focus on the future, not the past. This cultural imperative to move forward without looking back extended to personal matters. Questions about what husbands and fathers had done during the war, whom they had been with, what secrets they carried, went largely unasked. The social stigma of divorce and the practical difficulties of single motherhood meant many wives who learned uncomfortable truths chose to remain silent. They swallowed their hurt, maintained the fiction of stable marriages, and never spoke of what they knew. This silence protected their social standing and their children's futures. It also protected their husbands and allowed the double lives to remain partially hidden even after revelation. For the children of these marriages, the German children born to German wives, the silence meant they grew up never knowing they had half-siblings in other countries. The truth remained buried, sometimes emerging decades later, sometimes never emerging at all.
While German families grappled with their secrets and silences,
The children born in occupied territories carried the visible mark of their origins throughout their lives. The decades following the war saw these children grow up under stigma, discrimination, and often in painful ignorance of their own identities. In Norway, the Tyskerunga faced systematic mistreatment. The Norwegian government, eager to distance itself from collaboration, targeted these children and their mothers. Between 1945 and 1952, thousands of Tyskerunga were placed in orphanages or psychiatric institutions. Studies later revealed that these children suffered from abuse, neglect, and misdiagnosis at rates far exceeding Norwegian children generally. The Norwegian state went so far as to consider deporting these children to Germany or even to Australia. While these plans were never fully implemented, they revealed the depth of hostility these innocent children faced. It was not until 2005 that the Norwegian government formally apologized to the Tyskerunga and offered compensation. French children of German soldiers faced similar challenges. The stigma of being born from horizontal collaboration followed them through childhood and adolescence. Many grew up never knowing their fathers' identities. Their mothers, facing social ostracism, often refused to speak of the past. Some children were told lies about their parentage, or were raised believing themselves illegitimate without understanding the full context. In regions where German occupation had been particularly brutal, particularly in Eastern Europe, these children faced even harsher treatment. Soviet authorities showed no sympathy for women who had been involved with German soldiers, whatever the circumstances. Children born of these relationships were marked as having contaminated blood, a cruel echo of Nazi racial ideology turned back upon the children of Germans. The Lebensborn program children faced their own unique challenges. Lebensborn, meaning Fountain of Life, was an SS initiative designed to promote births of racially pure German children. The organization operated maternity homes in Germany and occupied territories where unmarried Aryan women could birth in secret, supposedly without shame. In occupied countries, particularly Norway, Lebensborn homes also served as locations where children born to German soldiers and local women could be brought into the SS's racial program. After the war, Lebensborn children faced suspicion and stigma. Rumors circulated about the program's true nature, with exaggerated or false stories of eugenic breeding farms. The children themselves often knew little about their origins. Those born in Norway to Norwegian mothers and German fathers were Tyskerunga who had passed through the Lebensborn system. They inherited the double stigma of being occupation children and being associated with an SS program. The psychological impact of growing up with stigmatized origins was profound. Studies of occupation children across Europe have documented higher rates of mental health problems, difficulties in forming relationships, and struggles with identity. Many spent decades searching for information about their fathers, hoping to understand half of their heritage. Some succeeded in making contact. In the decades after the war, as records became accessible and attitudes gradually shifted, some occupation children managed to trace their fathers. The reunions were rarely simple. German fathers who had hidden their past from their families faced exposure. Half-siblings met across language and cultural barriers. The emotional complexity of these encounters defied easy resolution. Many never found their fathers. German records from the war years were incomplete, destroyed, or inaccessible. Men who did not want to be found could remain hidden. And many had died in the war or in the decades since. For these children, now elderly, the questions about their origins remained unanswered.
Germany's approach to its past after 1945 shaped how the nation dealt with the hidden families and occupation children. The post-war period saw a determined effort to rebuild materially without fully confronting moral complicity. This selective memory had profound implications for how German families processed the revelations about soldiers' conduct during the war. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, Germans saw themselves primarily as victims. The bombing campaigns, the displacement of millions from eastern territories, the division of the country, and the hardships of occupation dominated public consciousness. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings held Nazi leaders accountable, but this accountability did not extend deeply into German society. The 1950s brought economic recovery and a determined focus on the future. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government promoted integration of former Nazi Party members back into society, arguing that Germany needed their skills for reconstruction. This reintegration required forgetting or minimizing past actions. The Wirtschaftswunder provided material prosperity that helped Germans move past uncomfortable questions about the recent past. Within families, this pattern of avoidance played out in intimate ways. Children who asked their parents what they had done during the war typically received vague answers or were told not to inquire. The soldier generation maintained silence about their experiences, both traumatic and shameful. Wives who suspected or knew of their husbands' betrayals often chose not to confront them, understanding that opening these wounds served no practical purpose in a society focused on rebuilding. This silence was not unique to Germany. Many societies that experienced the war engaged in their own versions of selective memory. But in Germany, the silence was particularly comprehensive because it served multiple purposes. It protected individual reputations, maintained family stability, avoided painful confrontations, and allowed the nation to move forward without becoming mired in recrimination. The children born in occupied territories became casualties of this silence. German fathers who might have acknowledged them, provided support, or maintained contact chose not to, partly because doing so would require breaking the silence about the war years. Acknowledging a Norwegian child or a French child meant acknowledging what one had done during the war, where one had been, and how one had lived. It meant risking one's marriage, one's reputation in the community, and one's own carefully constructed post-war identity. German law complicated matters further. Establishing paternity across national borders was legally complex. Child support and inheritance questions involved multiple legal jurisdictions. The division of Germany into occupation zones and then into East and West Germany added additional barriers. These practical obstacles combined with personal reluctance to create a situation where most German fathers simply never acknowledged their foreign children. The few men who did acknowledge their occupation children faced significant social costs. Their families often rejected them. Their communities viewed them with suspicion. The revelation marked them as having violated the ideals of faithfulness and duty that had supposedly guided the soldier generation. It was easier, much easier, to remain silent. This silence began to crack in the 1960s and 1970s as a younger generation of Germans started asking harder questions about the Nazi period. The student movement of 1968 explicitly challenged the older generation's silence about the war years. Yet even this reckoning focused primarily on the Holocaust and political crimes. The smaller, more intimate betrayals of hidden families remained largely unexplored.
It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that the issue of occupation children began receiving serious attention. This shift came partly from the children themselves, now adults and elderly, demanding recognition and answers. It came also from a new generation of historians willing to examine aspects of the war that earlier scholarship had overlooked. In Norway, the organization Krigsbarnsforbundet, the War Children Association, formed to advocate for the Tyskerunger. The organization lobbied the Norwegian government for recognition of the mistreatment these children had suffered and for compensation. Their efforts eventually succeeded in 2005 when the Norwegian government issued a formal apology and established a compensation fund. Similar organizations formed in other countries. In France, the organization Cœur sans frontières, Hearts Without Borders helped French war children search for information about their German fathers. In the Netherlands, organizations assisted Dutch war children in their searches. These groups shared information, connected individuals across borders, and pushed for official recognition of their existence and experiences. The Internet revolutionized these efforts. Suddenly, individuals separated by borders and languages could connect. Databases emerged where occupation children could search for information about their fathers. Half-siblings discovered each other's existences. German families learned that their fathers and grandfathers had hidden families abroad. The revelations were often painful for all involved. German families who had believed their patriarchs faithful and honorable faced uncomfortable truths. The elderly wives of deceased soldiers sometimes learned for the first time of their husbands' betrayals decades earlier. Children and grandchildren confronted the complexity of their family histories. Some families embraced the new relatives. Half-siblings formed relationships. Some German children traveled to meet their Norwegian, French, or Dutch half-siblings. These connections could be joyful, a completion of fragmented family histories, but they could also be fraught with resentment, guilt, and the weight of historical injustice. Academic historians also began examining the phenomenon more systematically. Studies documented the scale of relationships between German soldiers and women in occupied territories. Researchers investigated the military brothel system, the exploitation of women, and the legal frameworks that had governed these interactions. This scholarship revealed the full scope of what had occurred and its long-term consequences. Television documentaries and books brought these stories to broader audiences. Individual occupation children told their stories publicly. These narratives humanized the issue and forced wider recognition that the war's impact extended not just to the dead and the wounded, but also those born from occupation, those who lived with secrets, and those who discovered betrayals decades after the fact. The recognition came late for many. Occupation children in their 60s, 70s, and 80s received acknowledgement of their experiences only near the ends of their lives. Their German fathers were mostly deceased by the time the silence broke. The opportunity for direct confrontation, reconciliation, or even just explanation had passed. Yet the recognition mattered. It validated the experiences of those who had lived with stigma and silence. It forced acknowledgement that the war's human costs included not just the dead and the wounded, but also those born from occupation, those who lived with secrets, and those who discovered betrayals decades after the fact.
The story of German soldiers' hidden families illuminates broader themes about trust, memory, and morality in the context of war and its aftermath. The double lives these men led, the secrets that persisted for decades, and the slow process of revelation all speak to fundamental questions about human behavior under extreme circumstances. The power dynamics of occupation created conditions where exploitation flourished. German soldiers held life and death authority over occupied populations. This power corrupted personal relationships, making truly consensual encounters rare or impossible in many contexts. The women in occupied territories faced impossible choices, navigating between survival and resistance, between genuine feeling and strategic calculation. For German wives, the discovery of betrayal decades after the fact raised questions about the nature of the relationships they had believed they had. If their husbands had lived entirely different lives abroad, if they had formed attachments or families elsewhere, then what had the marriages meant? The letters, the expressions of longing, the promises of faithfulness had been either lies or revealed a capacity for compartmentalization that was itself disturbing. The children born from these relationships embodied the complex moral legacy of the war.
They were innocent of any crime, but marked by their origins. The stigma they faced revealed how societies processed guilt and complicity. Unable or unwilling to hold all individuals accountable for wartime actions, communities instead displaced their anger onto convenient targets, women who had fraternized and children who embodied occupation. The long silence about these issues reflected broader patterns of how societies deal with difficult pasts. Silence can serve pragmatic purposes, allowing people to move forward and rebuild. But silence also prevents healing, leaves questions unanswered, and passes trauma to succeeding generations who sense the weight of unspoken history. The revelation of hidden families also speaks to the gap between propaganda and reality, between how nations present themselves and how individuals actually behave. Nazi Germany constructed an elaborate ideology of racial purity, family values, and moral superiority. The reality of soldiers' conduct abroad revealed the hollowness of this ideology. Yet the propaganda had shaped how wives understood their world, creating a framework that made the eventual revelations all the more shocking. The international dimension of this history reminds us that war's consequences transcend borders. The children born in Norway, France, the Netherlands, and elsewhere were living links between Germany and the occupied territories. They embodied relationships that crossed enemy lines and complicated the simple narratives of good and evil, occupier and occupied. Their existence forced recognition that wartime interactions were messy, complex, and human. The decades-long process of seeking recognition for occupation children demonstrated the importance of acknowledging historical injustice, even when practical remedies come late or prove impossible. The Norwegian government's apology in 2005 could not undo the suffering of Tisker Unger, who had endured decades of discrimination. But it mattered nonetheless, validating their experiences and acknowledging state complicity in their mistreatment. The story of the secret families of Nazi soldiers reveals a side of war measured not only in deaths and destruction, but in betrayals, hidden lives, and generations shaped by silence. For German wives, the later discovery of double lives shattered trust and family bonds. For women in occupied territories, relationships born of coercion, survival, or affection brought stigma and hardship long after the war ended. For children of these unions, their origins marked them for life, carrying discrimination for circumstances beyond their control. These hidden histories expose the hollowness of Nazi propaganda about family and morality. They show how war erodes ordinary moral boundaries and leaves consequences that echo across decades. Silence after 1945 may have postponed recognition, but it could not erase the truth. Today, the descendants who seek answers ensure that these stories are no longer forgotten. Their struggle for acknowledgement reminds us that the legacies of war extend far beyond the battlefield, into families, memories, and identities. If you found this documentary valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. It helps us bring more hidden stories of history to light and ensures these voices are never forgotten.